Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. Today, we are celebrating the 50th episode of the Christ and Coffee episode. That is 50 episodes. And what better way to celebrate the Christ and Coffee podcast than talking about the book of Leviticus? So we're talking about Leviticus, that book of the Bible where you decide to read the Bible throughout the year. You read Genesis, you read Exodus, and then you get to Leviticus and you stop reading. The goal of this episode is to make sure you keep reading. So we're going to cover the book of Leviticus. Jeremy, what's up, my friend? Congratulations. We did it. 50 episodes.
50 episodes. I'm doing well, and I'm fighting off a cold. So if my voice sounds kind of Barry Manilow today, it's because I'm fighting off a cold that my daughter brought back from preschool. So fun times.
That's not a voice change for the 50th episode?
Not a voice change for the 50th episode. I'm not living into my broadcasting identity today.
Yeah, okay, that's good. I think we forgot that we could get like sick from other things after this year.
I know, right? I know.
And this pandemic is what kind of caused this podcast to start.
It is.
Hey, let's do a podcast.
That's right. We called each other after being stuck indoors and said, let's start recording. Yeah, what better way to celebrate 50 episodes than reading Leviticus? I had a professor who called Leviticus the graveyard of good intentions. It's like you said, the Bible plan for the year, and then you get to Leviticus and you're like, nah, maybe not.
Yeah. So let's jump right back into it then. So what does the word Leviticus mean?
Yeah, Leviticus it's from Latin, Leviticon, and it came from the Septuagint, which was Greek, and basically it just means Levites, who are the priestly tribe.
And that's one of the main themes of this book. It's like this ministry manual. Like for me, like when I was a young pastor, the ministry manual was boring to read when I was in seminary, but then it's like, oh my gosh, the thing is so helpful when I do the rituals of weddings, funerals, baptisms, you name it. There's this manual available to me to help sure I'm not making something up or missing something out. And like a large part of Leviticus is this ministry manual for the Levite family clan who are called to be this tribe of priests for the people.
That's right. Yeah, and so that's the Greek and the Latin name for the book. In the Hebrew, they literally, in all the books of the Bible in the Old Testament in Hebrew are named after the first word in that book. So in Hebrew, in the old ancient name for the text is Vayikra, which literally means God called. So yeah, interestingly, the whole book is kind of a public calling of the priests and a public sharing of their responsibilities and the rituals they're supposed to perform. The second half of the book, though, basically, I think so if chapters 1 through 16 are kind of about the priestly tribes and their ministry manual, the second half of the book is more geared towards the congregation and the people and how they're supposed to be holy like God is holy. And so the second half of the book is a little bit more public, but in both readings, everyone is involved in the hearing of the text. So it's like, just because you're not a Levite priest doesn't mean that you're off the hook reading the book.
Yeah, it wasn't just for one tribe; it was for all 12 tribes.
Right.
But there's a specific roles of the Levite clan. Now, this is something that like fascinates me. Lineages of clergy. So you're third generation clergy. Does it go further back?
As far as I know, I got 3 generations. I don't know how far it goes back after that.
Yeah, like, so I thought I didn't, like, because when I became ordained, that was a common question, like, other Armenians would ask me. It's like, oh, they assumed that, like, my dad was a pastor. I had a cousin of my grandfather who was a priest, so the people just assumed I was the grandchild, but it's like family, but not direct. But then, like, after my ordination, I found out that, like, I come from a long line of Derhad, Armenian Orthodox priests from Marash. Like, it goes back a few generations. But then, like, a couple of years ago, I had a random cousin from Toronto visit the church, and she's like a geneticist, and it's like, no, it goes way further back. like generations upon generations, it was the family business in the
Hmm.
town of Marash to be derhaj. And like my grandmother is from that line.
Hmm.
And I get my curly hair from that line. So
There
it's
you
like
go.
really fascinating, like this concept of like clergy life as a family business.
Hmm. Well, yeah, it's also counterintuitive to us as modern readers, right?
Exactly.
Like we stress this like concept of calling and agency and making the decision to be in a certain profession or a certain role. And yeah, early on in the Bible, it seems like, at least for the Levites as the priests, which seems odd to us, it's like, yeah, you're part of the family, you're part of the priesthood. You just, that's the whole family is called to do this task. So yeah, it is kind of interesting. It
Family
is
calling.
something like culturally I want to note that like the book of Leviticus is counterintuitive to most of our modern sensibilities. Like there's sacrifices, there's, hashing things in the language of clean and unclean and stuff like that. And it sounds odd to like modern readers. And I think that might be why some people just gloss over it, right?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of that and just like instructions on that weird thing. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to learn how to sacrifice an animal. Like we don't even do that. And then it
Yeah,
goes into
yeah,
detail about it, and then it's like a double whammy of instructions and just foreign to our
yeah,
ears.
yeah. It's like IKEA instructions on how to like cut the animal and put
Yeah,
it
yeah.
into the offering.
Who
Yeah,
likes IKEA instructions?
yeah, yeah. Um, I will say something culturally about it though, that like, I was thinking about how, you know, there is a sort of like respect factor that we hold when we visit somebody else's country or when we visit somebody else's territory. Like when, if I go to, you know, Italy, let's say, and I land in Italy, I want to know everything about their culture. Like I want to respect their way of being in the world. Like I'm not going to go to Italy and look for like a Pizza Hut or like look for macaroni grill or something in Italy. Like I want to live in their world. I want to experience the way they see things. And so when we read biblical texts, I think it's important for us to remember that it may sound weird and odd to us, but it really didn't to the world that it was written to. Like in fact, a lot of what's in Leviticus is in other like ancient Near East texts. Like it's not unfamiliar. And in fact, that's kind of a problem for some scholars. They're like, hey, like this isn't novel, and these people are supposed to be kind of a unique religion in the community of religions in the day. So I guess all that's to say, like, have some respect and empathy for the text when you enter into it. It's
Yeah,
not going to look like the 21st century, but that's what's so great about some of these texts.
yeah, absolutely. And like C.S. Lewis has a great line about this. It's called chronological snobbery, where you think
Mm,
your time of your place in human history is superior to others.
mm.
And that's not always the case. I mean, I guarantee you there's going to be parts of our generation people are going to really look down upon as weird and barbaric or just foreign. But yeah, but I think it's important too, like to stress the importance of like who they're worshiping, why are they making these sacrifices,
Mm, mhm,
what is considered holy and unholy as really the main theme of Leviticus. Like
mm,
this called people who are taken out of slavery, who are brought in the wilderness. God is, like you said, like last episode, like God is taking the Egypt out of them
mhm,
during
mhm,
this Exodus period where they're like stripping away from these Egyptian deities to worship the one true deity. And in this process, God is saying, I'm calling you to be a holy people, not just the Levites, but as a whole. I want you to be holy. And if you slip up, if you by circumstance or by will you sin, you need to go through this detailed process of making sure that your sin is dealt with.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I think. Well, I guess yeah. If you take a look at the whole book, there's kind of a constellation of different themes that touch each other, and and one of them is definitely the language of holiness, right? Like the holiness is the theme throughout the book, but I don't know that people really understand that language. So maybe we can start there. Like, what do we mean when we use the word holy?
Yeah, so it's like completely other, completely pure, completely divine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like the standard for what God wants us to be is holy. Um, so if it's completely other, then there's this notion that I also want you to be completely other. I don't want you to be like corrupted or impure or
Right.
part of the world, but separated.
Right. I think when a lot of people think or hear the word holiness, they think of like being morally upright or being like a good person. I think that's part of it to some degree, but I think holiness has this bigger picture of like being in communion with God who is other, like who is
Mhm.
set apart, right? So part of that is moral, morally upright, and but there's also just this aspect of being different and unique in the world because you've come into contact with God. Like when Moses sits up on the mountain with God, he comes down and his face is shining, right? Like he catches some of God's holiness and glory. Um, there's a line that like I think it's well, I think the Bible Project, if people are familiar with the Bible Project, they do a good job of comparing holiness to the sun, where like the sun kind of radiates this like really powerful life-giving presence, but it can be very dangerous, right? Like if you get too close to the sun, it burns you.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, this idea of holiness as being like this divine presence and energy that requires you to change and be different, but also doesn't just mean like morally good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like so, like at the center of this nomadic group in the wilderness is the holiness of God in the tabernacle. Like literally,
Right.
there's God's presence who's holy with them,
Right.
and all these rules and rituals are just to maintain close proximity to that which is holy.
Hmm.
And sin gets in the
Yeah.
way of that proximity. That's why like we talk about sin all the time as preachers, is because it's like it prevents you from this interaction with the one who's holy.
Right. Yeah, and proximity is a way to say nearness and like intimacy, right? Like
Mhm.
communion. And so I guess the if we were to kind of hinge together the themes of, the whole book, ritual, purity, priesthood, around that idea of holiness, then really the book is trying to figure out how we can be intimate with a God who's good and also dangerous, right? Like who's good. It's like again, I guess C.S. Lewis. You reminded me of C.S. Lewis when they talk about Aslan, and they ask the kids ask him, "Is Aslan safe?" And he's like, "Yeah, he's anything but safe, but he's good," right? Like, and so I think, yeah, it's important to make that distinction that the book is trying to engage us in intimacy with God, who is extremely good, but also can be potentially dangerous.
Yeah, and I think when we preach like sin salvation, like when I preach on sin, it's like my goal is not to shame you or to like guilt trip you. My goal is to get you close to God, like
Hmm.
as the priest, as the one who's proclaiming the message. And the only way we do that is through Jesus Christ, who's now the sacrifice once and for all, and also the high priest, who is able to get us into that which is holy,
Hmm.
because he is holy. Like the goal is practically like, all right, confess your sins because this is going to make your life better. Like just confess it. God's going to forgive you, but just
Hmm.
don't ignore it. Take it
Hmm.
seriously, but
Yeah,
confess it. There's a solution here, and it's going to really help your spiritual walk. Like,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that in Leviticus, not everything that is described as clean or unclean has to do with being sinful or not sinful.
right, it could
When
be
you
like,
get into Leviticus, there's lots of things that are unclean that have nothing to do with moral goodness or the opposite, moral evil. Um, they're just things for some reason that we don't really even understand or know that were considered unclean. And again, it's the language of drawing near to God's presence and energy after having come into contact with something that is unclean. Doesn't mean that you're morally evil, but when you come into the presence, it's like it's dangerous. There's been some research that says like the things they're supposed to avoid have to do with death, and death coming into contact with life, is just dangerous. And I mean, I don't know how far you can take that, but to a degree, it has more to do with coming into proximity to God's, divine presence with contact of these unclean things in hand. So it's about preparation. I mean, that's another aspect of Leviticus. It's like intentional preparation for contact with God, which I think is something we take lightly today in the 21st century, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. I mean,
coming into God's presence isn't something we really fear or prepare for. It's
I mean,
sometimes just something we like, yeah,
I
okay.
mean, I would love it if our churches like would like in Armenian apostolic tradition, though we were evangelicals, but we come from this tradition where like you were supposed to fast before you go to church on Sunday. You're supposed to confess your sins, make that
Mm,
up to date. You're supposed to like make sure there's not unforgiveness in your hearts towards your brothers and sisters. Then you worship God in this preparation into this holiness encounter every week. Um, it being the central part of the worship is the communion and the preaching of the word.
mm,
Um, it's like this preparation, this anticipation of being excited to be with God and God's people. I mean, that really is the real kicker for every church, regardless of the tradition. Like, are we prepared to worship? Are we
mm.
anticipating this moment of interacting the Holy Spirit in this moment of time? And I really think that's the kicker. Like, how do we motivate people to have that sort of mindset going into
Mm.
church? And if people have that mindset, I think these negative things about church you wouldn't be hearing about because it'd be like you'd be delighting in that which is holy.
Mm.
But you have to
Yeah,
prepare.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and there's also a lot of sacrifices in Leviticus, and I think sometimes we just lump in all sacrifice with some sort of payment for sin or something like that, or like asking for God's forgiveness. And some of them are. There's this big day in Leviticus called the Day of Atonement where
Mm-hmm.
they do that. There's an offering for sin. But there are other offerings. Like offerings don't always have to do with sin. They have to do with thanksgiving. Sometimes they're just a free will offering where somebody's thankful for God and they just drop stuff off as a sacrifice. It's not always animals. Sometimes it's wheat. Sometimes it's, just money. It's a different thing each time. So there's a lot of different ways sacrifices are integrated into Leviticus, and a lot of times it's just, you know, thankfulness for God's goodness and God's provision for the community.
Yeah, the whole first part is just details of these various sacrifices,
Mm.
um, and how to do it and why to do it. And it's not just not usually. I think when people preach on it, they usually refer to the Day of Atonement, like you said,
Yeah.
and they leave out the other ones. And I mean, Day of Atonement is huge,
Yeah.
um, but the other ones are just as important.
It's
Uh,
also still celebrated, as most of these festivals are in the Jewish community. But
yeah.
Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement.
Hmm.
If you're familiar with that day, and
Well, I'm definitely familiar with that day because of missing school in New York.
yeah, that's true. We
Rosh
didn't.
Hashanah, Yom Kippur, like school starts in the fall, and they're like, "Oh, the high holidays are around the corner. No
Yep.
school. This is great."
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Um,
Um. So yeah, there's also those festivals, right? There's all sorts of festivals towards the end of Leviticus,
mhm.
um, and those all become helpful in understanding the rhythm of time that Israel's supposed to live by.
Right.
It pays off when you get, especially to the Gospel of John. A lot of John's Gospel is structured around these festivals that Jesus takes in on himself and
Yeah.
says, "I'm what these were anticipating."
Yeah. Absolutely. So like it begins with these ritual sacrifices, and then it like uh, the second half ends like we talk about these high holidays, these festivals, and like we just had Memorial Day weekend. Like this is
Mm,
the unofficial beginning of summer, a time to remember the fallen soldiers.
mm,
Um, like there's this rhythm to American life with
mhm.
these holidays. They anchor it, and Memorial Day begins summer usually, and then Labor Day ends summer. It's a season of enjoying the summer days.
Yeah.
So like yeah, each culture has a rhythm and rituals, and the holidays play a huge anchor points to all that. Like we do Christmas on our January 6th, and that usually makes us a little unique as our Armenian Christian spirituality.
Mm.
So yeah, these holidays we just take it for granted. I mean, we have American Thanksgiving that makes Americans unique. I'm trying to think. I know Canada has their Thanksgiving, I think, around our Columbus Day, and then we revisited the Columbus Day. We're like, no, let's
Yeah,
not celebrate
yeah,
that anymore.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So like, I think a helpful way to read. Well, first of all, one thing, the church has a calendar year,
Hmm.
and we follow. We've talked about that, how we carve up our time according to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
And
So,
Ascension.
and ascension, yeah. um we carve out our time according to the Christ event in human history, and the Jewish calendar year organizes itself around the giving of the law in Sinai and the covenant that's made there. So that's one thing. But I also think, on a bigger picture, when we read Leviticus, a helpful way to structure it, or at least to conceptualize it, is that it's creating a grid to understand life in sacred spaces, sacred things, and sacred times. And so carving out those three things, like when you're reading Leviticus, you can be like, all right, what's the big picture here? Like, what are all these sacrifices about? It's like, oh, they're entering sacred space and these sacrifices are making provisions. Like, why are we reading about this holiday? Oh, it's sacred times, supposed to remind them of what God has done, keeping them in the rhythm and reflection on what that means for their daily life. So I just think sacred space, sacred things, sacred time, it's just a helpful way to kind of interact with the book.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. I like that. Um, I think like with the intention of keeping that sacred covenant healthy.
Right,
Like it's all relational at the end of the day.
right,
It's like all these things are here to make sure that relationship, that covenant with God is preserved.
right, right. And you read a book like Leviticus differently than you do the Gospels or
Right.
even the rest of the Torah. Like when you read Genesis and Exodus, they're stories, and then you get to Leviticus, and it's like instructions on yada 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 yada. So
Hmm.
like, I was just reading a comment by a scholar that was saying, when you read this ritual literature, you're supposed to be asking the questions: what is the worldview or the life that is being embodied in this ritual? So, what is the picture that's being practiced in this little micro ritual of sacrifice, of Thanksgiving offering, of the festival? Like, what is the bigger picture, like celebration and story, that is being distilled down in this little micro ritual that's taking place? So don't go into Leviticus thinking you're going to read it like the Gospels. You're going to ask different questions than you would reading any other story or narrative.
Right, right, absolutely. Are there any like favorite parts you have, Jeremy, like in Leviticus, that the highlights you enjoy?
Oh man, my absolute favorite part of Leviticus is in Leviticus 25, where they describe a thing that's supposed to happen that is never recorded as happening in the Bible. And it's called the year of Jubilee. And I love this concept. It's so pattern throughout Leviticus is the language of sevens because of Sabbath rest. So there's supposed to be a Sabbath every seventh day of the week to reflect on, God's resting. On the seventh year, there's supposed to be a Sabbath rest for the land. So every seventh year, on that seventh year, there's supposed to be a rest for the land. So nobody harvest or nobody sows anything, nobody works the land just rests. And then on the seventh of years, so on the 49th year, in the seventh month of that year, there's supposed to be this thing called the year of Jubilee. And it's basically a total reset, uh, financially, structurally, for all of Israel to reset back to how things were. So anybody who had debt obligations, those were forgiven. Anybody who was enslaved because of obligations to the debt, that they go back to their own land. All of the land reverts back to its original owners. So you just think about like the effect that has on record keeping, on structuring the economy, on structuring the political like guidelines for the people. Like it's just such a interesting concept. And when you think about, again, what I was saying, the whole sense of like, what is the worldview behind that ritual? It's that the land is God's, the money is God's, the people are God's. Like none of this belongs to you. So at the end of the day, when it gets to that year of Jubilee, it's like, boom, everything goes back to the beginning and everybody gets to celebrate sort of a restoration and a new start again. And I just think that's such a beautiful concept that unfortunately was never even recorded in the history of the Jewish Old Testament as have ever happening. I mean, it never seems like it was recorded as it taking place.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing too, that pattern of seven and then the seventh day meaning rest and completion and the
Yeah,
restoration.
yeah.
Um,
There's some speculation that when Jesus gets up in the temple, and not in the temple, sorry, in the synagogue in Luke, when he announces his launching of his ministry, that he's referring to not just Isaiah, but that Isaiah is even referring to kind of this year of Jubilee.
mhm.
So you could read what Jesus does as the enacting of this Jubilee year. That's one way to kind of frame or filter what Jesus is doing. But
Yeah, but
and
it's in
anyway, that's
there.
my favorite part of Leviticus. It's like a breath of fresh air when you get to the end and you hear this story of like how things should be. You're like, oh, there's the payoff. Like I got all the way to the end and there's something really good here.
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
Yeah. What about you? What's a highlight for you? Something you really enjoy in the book?
I like the notion of accidental sins and how accidental sins need to be forgiven. So, like, say you're driving and like you run over your neighbor's cat or something,
Yeah.
like it was an accident. I still need to ask God to forgive me for my accidental sin.
Mm-hmm.
I can't like so I think that's important. Even like if we do something stupid by accident, we still need to own up to it. So I
Yeah.
just love how there's like this whole section on it.
Yeah. Like this is what you do if you accidentally hurt your neighbor or yeah.
Yeah.
That's so funny. It's interesting that all of those things have to do with even in the accident there is an injustice done to somebody. So
Yeah.
how do you right the wrong in the yeah, that's so
You
interesting.
still like take responsibility for it. Like I think
Yeah.
that's key here too. It's like you take responsibility for your actions, even your accidental actions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like
There-
that too. What's something that's difficult for you in the text? I think there's plenty of places to trip up, but
yeah,
what do
yeah.
you find
So
specifically?
oftentimes when you get to the Day of Atonement, they use the scapegoat language.
Mm.
But that's not really in the Hebrew, from my understanding. I definitely want to delve more into it, but it's like a sacrifice to Azazel, like a demon. so, like for me, that's really exciting because a lot of the early church theories on atonement were about ransom theory, which is like part of Christ's sacrifice was to free us from the bondage of Satan.
Mm.
So going to atonement and viewing it from that spiritual lens
Mm.
really like not only makes more sense from the timeline of back then, but also for me like the spiritual dynamic of atonement, which often gets neglected and atonement theories or these sacrifices.
Mm.
So I think that's something I think is something I want to study more and
Mm.
learn, but it's kind of weird, but
Mm. Mm.
I think it's really important because I think it'll really flesh out some of the significance of the Day of Atonement
Mm.
back then, and also with our understanding of the Day of Atonement,
Mm.
with Jesus Christ being the once and for all sacrifice.
Mm.
So I think that's really interesting to know your Hebrew versus how translators kind of like sometimes, all right, this doesn't make sense. Let's just throw in some weird. Let's throw in some words to make
Yeah.
it make sense of this passage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, there's definitely the substitutionary aspect in these sacrifices, which is key.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think another interesting passage is um, the sons of Aaron committing
Mm.
uh, a sacrifice. They didn't follow the instructions properly. They brought in this strange fire, and it led to them being killed. So
Mm. Yeah, that's always
that's always
difficult to
fun.
grapple with. But it's again this thing of like God being good and also dangerous, right? So
Right.
like yeah, they came into contact unprepared and without instruction and yeah, that's the in the world of that culture that meant death. That was destruction.
Right. It's like you didn't follow the manual.
Yep.
You brought
You
in
die.
the
Yeah.
consequence. It's
Yeah.
consequence.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You're dealing with danger here.
I think that's probably the difficult thing for me to understand in Leviticus. It's not a specific text, but the whole like worldview of Leviticus is um by nature very kind of black and white, and so sometimes it's hard for me to grapple with. um I also think I want to understand better. It's not necessarily that it's difficult, but I want to better understand the world in which these stories or these rituals were prescribed. um so again, it goes back to like being a vacationer, a traveler. You want to understand the place you're going to, and I want to understand that a little better. Like, I was just reading about how other ancient Near East cultures had similar sacrificial systems, and they conceptualized them as like the altar was the table that you were laying the sacrifices in for the god to eat from, right? And I don't know. I just, that's interesting to me to like plot that within the culture and understand the differences and the similarities and how that like bears fruit for understanding. I mean, rituals that we perform. I mean, we perform a ritual at a table either every Sunday or every month, depending on your church tradition. We sit around a table and we break bread and we celebrate the sacrifice of Jesus Christ,
Hmm.
the bread and the cup. And so it just strikes me as interesting. If I can start to understand a little bit of this world, how can I filter it through the lens of our cultural experience and make it meaningful for us today?
Right. And then in doing so too, it kind of magnifies like what Jesus did. And
Mm-hmm.
like, because it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to understand the gospel without going into this stuff. Uh,
Mm,
then it could just be like symbolic, nice love of Jesus
mm-hmm.
versus it actually doing something. Because there's
Mm,
something innate about every civilization having some sort of structures of rituals with sacrifice in it. It's just like a
yeah.
human thing
Yeah.
across the world. So
Well,
like, what is that? Like,
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and I also just think like we have this aversion to ritual, but the irony is everything about our life is ritualed,
mhm.
Like I I get up and make a coffee every morning. Like it's just something I do every morning without even thinking about it. And we have these rituals around holidays and we have these rituals in our church, like, communion and Eucharist. Like, rituals are not bad. In fact, they perform our deepest beliefs. Like, they
Right.
put out in front of everybody what we actually care about and value.
I think a more secular word to use instead of ritual is just what are your habits?
There you go. Yeah.
Habits. Like what are
Yeah.
you doing? Like what's automatic in your life?
Yep. Yep.
Whether it's uh, time, space. What was the three? That was pretty cool. It's time, space, and
Things.
things. Yeah. What are your
Yeah.
habits
Awesome.
with those three things?
Yeah. Well, and even to think about habits and um like the purpose of these rituals in Leviticus is to make a habit of contact and intimacy with God in a way
Hmm.
that is safe and relational. So again, to ask ourselves the questions, what are the habits we have, and are they perpetuating intimacy with God, and are they welcoming this sort of connection and intimacy with the divine through Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Um
they're called spiritual disciplines, spiritual
there you go.
habits.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I think I'd be amiss if I didn't mention this before we wrap up, but people hate on Leviticus and criticize Leviticus and say it's like irrelevant and ridiculous and why do we even study it anymore? But I don't know if anybody's noticed that. I'm sure people have because it's come to my attention through other people. But when somebody in the Gospels, I think 3 out of 4 of the Gospels have this encounter when somebody comes up to Jesus and says, "What is the greatest commandment?" And he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength," which is from Deuteronomy. And then he quotes Leviticus and he says, "Love your neighbor as yourself."
So
So,
the
according
golden
to Jesus,
rule,
Leviticus is one of the most important books in the Bible to understand what
yeah,
God wants and desires for mankind.
not just like I don't know if this is like like one of the earliest, if not the earliest, declarations of the golden rule right there. Like it's there. It's in Leviticus, guys. Treat others
Right
as
there.
you want to be treated.
There you go. There you go.
Uh, is that where we need to wrap up? Just end it on the golden rule.
There you go.
All right, everyone.
Everybody be good to your neighbors.
Treat others as you want to be treated. And then Jesus fulfills that and says, "This is what true goodness is, true
Right.
holiness is.
Right.
Now that I'm going to sacrifice myself, a new command I give you: love others as I have loved you."
Yep. Yep.
And then that brings it to the fulfillment of that But that's huge. That line.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we wrap it up this way and say, if you haven't read Leviticus, try to read through some of it with kind of the tools we've given you here this afternoon or this morning,
Mm-hmm.
whenever this airs. I forget. But or whenever you're listening. And feel free to reach out with questions or confusing things that don't make sense. You can Facebook message us or drop us links and emails. We'd love to answer your questions.
Yeah, and the other thing too is important too, not just to cherry pick verses, but read it in its entirety and understand the sections, because I think that's part of the
Right.
dynamic too.
Yeah, and to remember it as it's literally the spilling over of the Exodus story.
Mm-hmm.
Like it literally reads just like, and God said, you know, it's like it's not really another book, it's just a continuation of
Yeah, yeah,
Exodus.
yeah.
I don't know if they ran out of scroll space or something and they just started a new book or what it is, but it it literally just kind of continues the bigger story of God redeeming a people for himself.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. 50 episodes in. Thank you for getting to the end of this episode. So grateful for all the listeners. Thank you for listening. Don't just take our word for it. Read the good word yourself. Pick up the Bible. Stay caffeinated, my friends. And thank you all for listening to the Christ and Coffee podcast. God bless you.
Happy 50th.